And we are also recording this so that people who can't make it will have access. And if you need to review anything, you'll also have access. So hi everybody, welcome to the second of our little mini series of workshops that we're calling SPD Summer School. Just a little bit of housekeeping, which I will go over again as more people probably filter in. If you want to select speaker view at the very top of your screen, you can make sure that you can, you'll be looking at the person who is speaking or the slideshow that they're presenting, and that can be very helpful. You should be unable to unmute yourself. There will be a Q&A process at the end of this. If you want to put any questions you have, even as the workshop is going, you can do that in the chat. If you want to find the chat, if you're not familiar with Zoom, if you hover over the very bottom of your screen, you should see a couple of icons there, and you'll see a word bubble that says chat, and you can go ahead and click that. I will open up a window where you can ask your question. I'm going to go ahead and keep track of all of those, so you don't have to ask more than once, and we'll be answering them at the end. We'll be sharing the recordings as well as the slideshows that you see. The slideshows have some links in them, so you will have access to that, and then I can also let you know where you can access that same information on our website. There is a survey we made for after the workshop for you to give us some feedback if you have any, and I'll be dropping that in the chat as well. And I can go ahead and start the introductions. So SPD Summer School is a 3-part series of hour-long workshops by SPD directors, managers, and staff aimed at illuminating the current state of small press publishing. As the industry changes with COVID-19, this nut and bolts program aims to demystify the distribution process and provide foundational knowledge that will allow publishers to better adapt to the present moment according to their specific needs and priorities. While this workshop is intended to serve the publishers we already work with, SPD is offering this free to the general public so that we might support any emerging small press publishers, as well as authors and booksellers curious about how distribution can affect sales and publicity. Thank you for joining us for this, which is our second workshop. Logistics 101 is an overview of book publishing and distribution with Brent Cunningham. Brent Cunningham is the Executive Director of SPD and has been an integral part of the small press publishing community in the United States for over 20 years. And before Brent takes it away, I just want to make sure everybody here is on the same page. If you hover at the top of your screen and click on speaker view, you can make sure you are looking at the person speaking or their presentation. And if you have any questions, even as they come up throughout the whole workshop, you can go ahead and put those in the chat, which you will see access to, if it's not open already, at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's an icon that is a word bubble in the middle. It says chat. You can click on that. And without further ado, Brent Cunningham, it's your time to shine.
Thank you so very much, E. And it's just fabulous to see so many people. I recognize a lot of names out there. And thank you all for attending a workshop called Small Press Logistics. I don't know if you should pat yourself on the back or maybe question some of your life choices that brought you here, but regardless, I'm gonna go with the former, and welcome, and we hopefully will get into some good information today. I will say, you know, we're making a few assumptions about a lot of you. I think a lot of you probably are, you know, SPD presses. This is pretty nuts and bolts stuff we'll be going through. Some of you might be prospective SPD presses. Some of you, we assume most of you are perhaps literary presses, although a lot of this stuff would be fully applicable if you're going to start a press that's not a literary press, but nonfiction or something like that. We probably do still have pretty high density of people who were the only person in school in the 10th grade who thought Frank O'Hara was cool. But regardless, welcome, and we're going to try to make it for pretty much everybody. And I think you probably already know, but very briefly, SPD is a nonprofit book distributor. We're the only one in the country that we're really aware of. We've got about 350 small publishers, and we'll get into some of what all those terms mean quite quickly. In fact, let me go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to go into the slideshow. So Small Press Logistics 101 with me, Executive Director of SPD. You know, logistics, maybe it refers to the textbook definition, you know, detailed coordination, moving through things through a system. We are thinking of it also to kind of broaden it out in terms of structure, right? There is a pre-existing structure in the book industry. You as a small press, it's a square pegs, round hole kind of thing. You know, it's the, can you set your press up in such a way that it's going to fit into that structure? If it's not going to fit, are you aware that it's not going to fit, and why beforehand, or is this going to take you by surprise? So we're here to help with that. I'll also say before we dive in that, you know, at SPD, a lot of times the goal, the broadest goal, and the assumption we're making is that you as a small press will in the end break even. And that's kind of our, you know, our horizon goal sometimes for a small press. And that does not include usually paying yourself either. So a lot of your labor might be donated. There are many models that may not fully fit that, but that's the basic assumption that we're going with here as you look to get your books out into the world. All right. Let's make sure I can. So, you know, it's complicated. It is very complicated. There's a lot to learn, and it can be overwhelming. But, you know, you're already watching this, so kudos to you, like I said. I think that, you know, someone contacted me the other day who was an author, and they had a good sounding book. And I asked them, you know, when they thought about publishing it, and they said it would arrive like the next day. And this was their first step of calling someone to try to figure out the book industry, right? So you're already ahead of a lot of people just asking these very basic questions. But there's a lot of detail, and so get ready. We do want to make sure that some of the core vocabulary, it can trip you up. I hear a lot of people, you know, think certain terms in the book industry mean something. So let's quickly try to go through it, make sure we're all on the same page. Types of printing, we use these terms a lot. POD, sometimes known as digital printing, versus offset. Offset is the older technology, right? You make plates. POD is the more recent technology. The reason it's so important for a small press to understand this is there is a kind of break point. We use the thumbnail of about 500 copies. If you think you're going to sell more than 500 copies, then offset's probably going to work better for you. Financially, the per book cost is going to be less. But you also have the money up front to get those 500 copies. POD or digital printing, that technology has really come along in the last 5-10 years. It's fairly indistinguishable from an offset product. Many of these 350 presses at SPD, producing about 1,000 new books a year, are using POD digital printing at this point. One reason I like to clarify it is that people will use the term POD, and what they often mean is digital printing, but a portal, and this is like the Lulu or KDP, a sales portal for those digitally printed books. Usually when we talk about POD or digital printing, we're just using it as a printing technology, a specific printing technology versus offset. We also want to define some of the types of publishers since we use these terms. To me, this is a handy way to divvy some of these up. The majors, you may have heard of some of them. They certainly dominate most of publishing. This is the Penguin, Random House, Hachette, HarperCollins, Macmillan, Simon Schuster. At SPD, we tend to distinguish between independent presses, the turquoise part of the slide, and small presses per se. And there's different ways to define it, but very broadly, there's fluidity between it, you know, 1 or 2 employees unpaid versus, you know, quite a few more, 1 to 10 titles. And one of the key distinguishing markers would be really how many books are printed, and then in the end, how many are sold. A small press, which is most of what's on SPD, 1,000 is a pretty high success. Time to break out the champagne. An independent press would sort of expect 1,000 from most of their publications. Micro presses we define as really not having ISBNs, and that's the marker there. I do, you know, you hear people in the book industry, people from the majors, sort of talking about small press, and they'll sometimes mean Grey Wolf, which to us is an independent press. But that's how we kind of define it. You'll also notice that self-publishing isn't really on this, but is because it crosses so many of these worlds, it's harder to define. But from these definitions of size of the run and so forth, this is really what we mean for small press. Terms that I often also get asked about: what's a distributor, what's a wholesaler, what's a jobber? Distributors tend to represent a specific limited group of presses. They generally warehouse the whole run, but SPD is an exception there. We do not, even though we are a distributor. And they provide all kinds of services, especially marketing and publicity services, double checking metadata. We had a great earlier session on that, and it can be absolutely crucial, as anyone who attended that I'm sure learned. You know, they can help out with the publisher calendar. The wholesalers or the jobbers are really just wholesalers that are providing additional services to libraries, kind of same kind of concept, same sort of entity. They're not going to give you any marketing help, you know, once they get the book. They're really just a one-stop shop for the book. And as long as we're on it too, you know, we don't want to ignore that there are many entities now. It's so easy to produce a book, let's say, in terms of the printing technology. There's a lot of people doing what we call DIY distribution. It means they don't really have an official distributor. There's a couple ways to do it. One is you're just out there selling off your website, and you are, you know, making the sales directly and doing the best you can, maybe a few consignment sales. Another way is to use that one of these POD systems where they will feed into a wholesaler, usually for you, Ingram, and you get some distribution to the trade, the book trade, through that method. But obviously there's a whole lot of services you don't really get from either of those methods. And that's why people end up using distributors frequently. All right, let's see. So margins, super fun. You know, I, like a lot of you, I'm going to guess, I did not hang out on the business major side of campus. I was definitely on the liberal arts, literary side. And it's surprising to me that I spend so much time with spreadsheets and percentages and margins and numbers and so forth. But breathe into it. It's a way of life, and you're really, it's really worth either developing some of these senses of how the dollar is split up in these books, or finding someone who does want to do that for you. A lot of our more successful presses either have somebody who's good at accounting or the general principles. This is an example. I think it's a reasonable example of how things would be split up for a small press book. You kind of start at the left, and you've got your core printing costs. You have to think in terms of author royalties. Important to put an asterisk there and say that there's all kinds of models for how to structure author royalties, from just paying in copies at the small press level, There's ways to pay off the list price. There's ways to pay off the net, the amount of money you get back from your distributor as a publisher. Then you get your, I put in quotes to try to be funny, your profit, 5%. Seems pretty realistic after you're paying the printing costs and paying the author royalties. Your distributor, this is going to look like we're gouging you, but really when you think about everything a distributor does, especially to SPD, you know, you can kind of, our finances are pretty public, and you can see we're not actually making a whole lot. There's a lot of costs in terms of those services I talked about as to what a distributor does. Then a wholesaler. So this is imagining that in this structure, if you go again left to right, you know, the publisher has sent the book to the distributor sent the book to the wholesaler has purchased it, and a wholesaler is selling to the reseller, and then they're finally selling to the customer. So not only is it important to think in terms of how much money am I going to get back, I think this is also a useful chart for realizing how many hands your books really have to pass through. And that's, to me, the big thing to learn as a small press publisher, that there are a lot of people touching this book, and that really explains a lot of things about it, you know, from what kind of stuff you put on the back matter to the pricing, and all that is part of this journey, and how many people it could pass through. Now, if you can cut out one of these little funny shaped bars, then you know you have a new structure, right? The reseller on the far right could buy directly from the publisher. They have reasons why they don't, but some do. The distributors, SPD will sell directly to a lot of bookstores, and we cut the wholesaler out. So there's more money involved, and the percentages cascade differently and change quite a bit very quickly. So that's your basic margin chart, or a possible, feasible, realistic one. Now we're going to move on to what I think of as the 3 basic tools. If your margins are not really working, you're trying to fit it into the book industry, and you just keep calculating it back and forth, and you're like, oh, we are losing money. First of all, you're not alone. A lot of publishers, small press publishers, in that boat, and are surprised to learn when they put all the costs into a calculator that getting the book to the right place is going to cost them money. I sometimes joke that, you know, you should just lay like a $10 bill inside every book. That would be a good marketing plan that way, and then charge $10 for it. It's sometimes feels like what it's like being a small press. But I just want to emphasize that, you know, there are some things that remain under your control as a small press, and usually using all 3 of these tools and more is how our most successful presses tend to hang in there. So first of all, to really take the printing seriously, we touched on it already, but, you know, look at offset, figure out that per book cost, shop around, look at all the additional costs, and remember that everything you decide around that book could add some costs. I should say printing is really, the printing game is all about page count usually. So when your book gets longer, it tends to get more expensive pretty quickly. This can be kind of an advantage for the classic 85 to 110 page poetry book in some ways. We have seen also some foreign printers sometimes come in with lower costs. Often depends on the exchange rate and so forth. But I would look at all of those tools to try to drive that per book cost. I mean, let's go back. I'll go back here. You know, this is your far left item. If you can shrink those printing costs 15 to 13%, what happens? Well, the publisher profit goes up, right? A couple percent. So printing, key thing. We mentioned here's a few of our preferred printers. These are just printers that SPD publishers tend to use with a lot of frequency. We see a lot of boxes come in from them, and we've gotten good responses back. So we'll have some links to their websites for you. And, I think to speak again, customer service, I think I mentioned this, I'll go back. Customer service matters. That's the second item, shop around. There's just so many ways that a printer who is familiar with small press publishing specifically can help you out. And so it's totally worth choosing a printer accordingly. So these are the 5. Do get quotes. They should send you samples. Look at what they've done. Yeah, I will say too that we should mention CLMP, the Community of Literary Magazines and Presses. They are a great resource if you want to be a member. It's often worth it. It's scaled to your size. They're kind of a sister organization to SPD. And there's a lot of talk on their listservs all the time about printers and sharing information, as well as about really everything that I'm covering today. So they're a great resource if you're into it, but also just ask your peers and so forth. Pricing, I'm always hammering about pricing. It's the way the book industry has gotten structured is that many things that used to be kind of under the purview of the publisher have been taken away. Some of their powers have been taken away. You have to play, and you're moving into the book market in such a way that you're going to have to kind of play by their rules and their structures. But price is one of the things that publishers still have a lot of freedom with, and you should take it seriously. Give some time to considering exactly what you're going to price the book at. And we're often making the argument at SPD that, look, these are, this is the 3rd item, small presses are like local organic farmers. There's a lot of publishers who will say, I really want my book cheap and accessible. It's beautiful. You care about the end user. You have the end user in mind, the reader. It's why you're in this at all. It's why in the 10th grade you cared about Frank O'Hara, all that. But the reality is you're moving through a supply chain, and the idea that the books are going to be cheaper or as cheap as books that are printed in much larger runs, where the per book cost is much cheaper, is just not going to square very well with reality. So we always say, like, price it as high as the market will sort of bear, and that's probably how it's going to work out. We also suggest pretty regularly that you take a look at really figure out your per book cost, and what you want to do is figure out your price based on that. So if your per book cost is $3, then you're only going to get about $5 or $6 back from your distributor, and you got to pay some author royalties out of that, and you swiftly calculate that the book needs to be $20 or something. But you also have to watch the top of the market. It can go too high, and it's not even always that the author or the reader will put the book back on the shelf, but that the middle people we were talking about, the fact that it passes through so many hands, there will be a point where that will indicate, oh, I'm not really going to touch that. That's just overpriced. So that's the basic there. Obviously, it's surprising, the last one. We really do get a lot of publishers when I walk them through this, that they realize every book they're selling, they're losing money, and they weren't aware of it. So take the time to figure that out. And usually what that indicates is they priced it too low. The last thing we want to touch on is crowdfunding. At the small press level, it really is an exercise of love. It's an exercise of community. It is, in our opinion, worth really thinking about who needs this book and why, and being as comfortable as you can be going out to that group and asking them to participate. We do feel that, transparency is key, to be ethical about it. You have to tell early and often, authors submitting for contests, donors, exactly what the dollars are paying for. We're going to have another session where I think this will come up as well, involving acquisitions and with Jane, Gregory, and Andrew Pye. You know, just be clear. And there are some publishers that we've run into where it's usually just a matter of lack of transparency. Someone thought that they were paying for this or that, and they were upset later that they were not. We do at SPD, you know, tend to make a distinction between publishing projects that we take on and what we would think of as author-funded projects. And SPD's feeling is that, you know, inviting the author to participate in some marketing costs would be fine, but asking them to fund the production costs of the books is kind of the line where it becomes more self-publishing, which is a perfectly legitimate model, but just needs to be open, and it happens to not be the one that SPD distributes for. A little bit more about crowdfunding. You know, this is speaking really from where SPD lives too, as a nonprofit out there writing grants all the time. It's just a general rule. You know, chasing after money, green unicorns, can really quickly move you away from your mission and editorial coherence. It can feel like the money's there, but you have to really tweak something. So really take a look before you go after something. Realize you don't have to go after every pot of money if it doesn't really fit with the press. It's often also true that in our experience, I think that if you go after some pot of money that really doesn't fit, you're probably not going to get it anyway, and you will have wasted a bunch of time writing the grant. Most people know about it, but you can, you know, it's a lot of work to be a 501c3. It can be quite a process with the IRS, but instead what you often need to do is to find someone who'll be your fiscal sponsor, and that is a much easier process. You can apply for funding. Most pots of money will allow you to apply for them with just being a fiscal sponsor. A lot of, I mentioned that a lot of our translations have been partly funded by cultural budgets of different countries. So be creative about where you might get some of those funds. So those are the 3 tools. That's the presentation. I think we wanted to, as early as possible, open it up to some questions and just feel out where this particular audience is. But you know, we try to be available and open. I spend a lot of time talking to prospective publishers, and so don't be shy either. We you know, we're busy, but we do want to help small publishers come into the world, and particularly to have a model that doesn't cause them a year later to have to collapse or max out some credit cards. Anything we can do to do that. Obviously, the ultimate goal is to bring some much needed literature into the world. But these nuts and bolts things are absolutely crucial to the projects that continue and can be sustained and can eventually really make a cultural difference. So thank you all for listening. That's the show.
Oops, sorry. Awesome. Thank you so much, Brent. And thanks everybody. I see some questions in the chat box now. Before getting into that, I do just want to direct people, like Brent mentioned, you could always email somebody from SPD, Brent directly, if you'd like. And we're always available to help. In addition to that, we do have some resources on our website in what we call the publisher portal, which is partially linked above that link with publisher tools, which has some of our preferred printers and things like that. So I want to make sure you all have access to that moving forward. But I'd love to start with the Q&A portion. So please just, if you have questions, put them in the chat. They will get answered in the order that they are asked. And let's get it started. So we have a question here from Patrick Davis. And this, I believe, was in regards to the margins chart. For the 5% target for your author royalties, are you including the advance amount paid within that 5%?
Great question, Patrick. I will preface it by saying that when you work as a distributor, your relationship is really with the presses, and the presses then have the relationship with the authors. We're not the best experts for how people structure author royalty contracts, but I have been in the industry for 20 years and I've talked to a lot of publishers, so I will dare to just briefly say a couple of things, and I seem to have an okay head for numbers. And just to help understand the chart too, fundamentally there seem to be two ways to pay author royalties. One is you pay a percentage of the list, and then one is you pay a percentage of the net. Right, so in the list case, you're saying, I'll give you 5% of this book's list price regardless. Net means I'm going to wait and see what I was paid for this particular book from the distributor, and then I'm going to give you a percent of that. The latter is generally a much better way to do it. You know, you can do your calculations wrong on the list, and turns out your distributor, you know, sold a lot of books at a deep discount, which in turn, well, I should pause and say SPD pays our publishers on the net, right? We're not going to pay you, we don't pay our publishers a fixed percent of the list. It depends what we sell it for. So if we sell the book for more, the publisher gets more, gets a bigger chunk. If we sell at a deep discount to the trade, to a bookstore or something, then the publisher gets less. So we can't even tell you there's a fixed percentage at SPD that you get. We usually say around 1/3 of the list price to give presses a sense of what they're going to get. So it has the same pros and cons when you structure your author royalty contract that way. The author is going to have a harder time understanding how much they're going to get paid and why, and you might have to have more conversations, but it is financially sounder to pay on the amount of money you get rather than on some imaginary amount based on the list that you may or may not get. But that 5% was just pretty arbitrarily chosen. You have to really look at these contracts to figure out what a particular author is going to get. And I will say too that a lot of times there's two elements to those contracts that seems like some of our better presses tend to do. You look at copies as a form of payment. You know, maybe that's not entirely the royalties, but you write it in there. You get 50 copies, and you get this, you know, maybe slightly lower royalty rate. And there's also all kinds of, you know, the royalties start at 200, the 200th copy, or the 500th. You know, you have a lead in case the book does very, very poorly. That you are not on top of having sold barely any books. You have to write a check to the author. So there's many ways to structure these contracts, and CLMP is a good source. I think the Author Guild can help you, and just talking to other publishers.
Wonderful, thank you so much. This is kind of a follow-up to that from Sherry Rind. Presses are increasingly moving towards a hybrid model where authors contribute to book production and marketing costs. Just to be clear, SPD will not distribute such books. This was lightly touched on in your points.
Yes, you've gone right to the, it's complicated. What was the quote? It's complicated, Maud. I think that we, as an entity, we don't want to make those kinds of hard and fast rules. We understand the drive to get authors to pay for production costs. We just have found that, generally speaking, for an SPD press and the kind of project that's going to succeed here, there's too many. I think mostly it's about editorial coherence and the pressure that starts to happen when one particular author has plenty of money to pay for the production costs and the other author does not, but maybe the first author is not really, doesn't give that shape to your press. I mean, you know, what's driving this, and I think what's behind it, is that as a distributor, we're out there talking to the trade. We're talking to booksellers, libraries, and for a small press, you know, your first book might do well, it might not do well, but over time, the idea at SPD is to build kind of a brand so that that bookseller says, oh, that's an action book. I don't really know that author. I don't really know whether it's good or bad, but I have a track record. I've sold some action books well, and they have a shape. There's a sort of shape to their list. It's not too specific because no writer wants to be pigeonholed, and you can say the same with Ugly Duckling. You can say the same with Dorothy. You're like, there's a shape there, and those tend to be the presses that do well. So it's not so much that we don't feel judgy towards it, but I think that it's something we look out for. It's something that I think we'd be cautious about, and you usually see the evidence of the authors are really the ones funding it.
Wonderful. So Martin Willits Jr. asked how to submit books to SPD. We are actually going to be having a workshop. Our next workshop is going to be how to become an SPD publisher and a little bit about our process. In the meantime, just in the for the sake of the short period that we have here, I'm going to just go ahead and send the link to our how to become an SPD press page on our website, which has a lot of information and is also in that publisher portal, which can be super helpful. Another person, and just to move forward with the questions, another person, Prince, is asking, any experience with Sheridan printing?
It rings a bell. I know them, but I'm sorry, I'd have to look them up. I feel like I've heard good things about them, but I don't even want to say that for sure. There is a resource that that CLNP has recently built, spreadsheet coming, and I think they're on that list as well. I should say these so-called preferred printers, I mean, it really is the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of solid printers doing great work, and there's also a lot to kind of be aware of, I suppose, but can't specifically speak off the top of my head to Sheridan. We can get back to you.
Okay, next question is from Frenchie. Thanks again, Brent. Do you have any thoughts about a stakeholder model as a means to acquire funding for a small press if it's for profit? So that might have to do with some of this crowdfunding question.
Yeah, I'd have to know a little more what the model is. I mean, I hope it comes across that we are completely sympathetic to the economic challenges, and if there's a model that seems transparent and plenty ethical and treats everyone fine, then you know you gotta do what you have to do to bring these books out, and you should. I do know that, you know, some of these models include that seem really positive. You have advanced sales to a specific community of people. Maybe that's part of that stakeholder. Essentially, you know, going to some community and saying, I want to publish this book. I don't have the money to do it. You all want this book to exist. Let's talk about how that's going to happen. I think that's a great way to go. And a lot of the point of this presentation was, if you have nervousness around that, if you're not used to fundraising and asking for money, I encourage you to try to get over it. It's a learnable skill. I wasn't comfortable when I started 20 years ago, and now I'll look rich people in the eye and ask them for a check.
Great. So Mylon asks, if I am a small / micro press, what is the best way to approach a distributor if I'm doing the printing or publisher?
Right. Good question. So the problem with the small micro presses, especially the way we define them, is essentially, well, there's a few factors. The lack of ISBN makes it nearly impossible to effectively distribute a book into the book trade in America. It's just going to be a slog. Amazon will charge you, Ingram just won't take it. The other factors just involved here, if you think about it, so by book trade, we mean bookstores and libraries mostly. Even if we're selling to a wholesaler, they're turning around and selling to a bookstore. Bookstores do not want books without a spine with printing on it, because they're not going to put your little book face out. That's usually something they charge a publisher for to be face out in a bookstore. So you're going to be spying out, and now nobody can read it. Even though a lot of us at this meeting probably crawl through bookstores and find little treasures, most buyers just do not. The book might as well be thrown in the trash once you cannot read the spine on the shelf. So booksellers aren't going to touch it. Libraries have reasons around permabinding, apparently, where the plastic kind of sticks together if there's too few pages. So you end up, I mean, thanks be, I guess, to the internet, you know, you set up your website, you sell it direct, you get better margins than working with a distributor. And that tends to be the model for a small micropress doing any kind of small printing, and it can work. I often say, as a tangent, you know, I always say you could survive financially on any size press. Mostly what you have to know beforehand is how many copies you're going to sell. And that's true of a small micropress too. I mean, I could create a press that I know is only going to sell one book, and I could be fine. I just price it at $2,000 list price. You know, but it's an exaggeration, but generally speaking, you know, you can find people who will pay a little more. You work with rare libraries if you're doing, you know, I've got a press where I did silkscreen covers, and so that's the basic small micro press law. So there's structural reasons why you can't fit into that supply chain.
I would just add that there's also lots of like tabling events, specialty source, kind of a different model for getting the work out there, just not to reduce it to sort of some of the negative parts. But moving on a little bit, Miette Gillette, I wonder about becoming a 501c3. What is the general administrative overhead in terms of time? I feel like it might be the next logical step for my press, but I am overwhelmed by the thought of the paperwork. And that is a very layered question. So maybe, Brent, if you just want to kind of like briefly, just so we can get through some of these other questions.
Sure, I'll be briefer. You know, I have not taken an entity through the 501c3 process, but I've certainly been told it's a lot of work. The way, in a nutshell, the IRS, once they hand you the 501c3, they don't actually do a lot of oversight because they're not collecting any taxes from you. So the bar to getting it is really kind of the front door. It's that first process that's the administrative work. You probably are going to need a lawyer. I think you're definitely going to need a lawyer. So, you know, it's feasible, but it can be pretty darn hard. And really, my sense is that the fiscal sponsor relationship will get you most of the way there. The other way is to partner with somebody that already has a 501c3. But anyway, once you have the 501c3, since that is something that we do, there's really not a lot of administrative work. You've got to maintain the board, but that can be pretty small. You have some obligations. If you've got a good board, a working board, it tends not to be that hard for a small entity, but getting it itself is the challenge.
All right. So there's a comment from Anne about margins. And I think this is helpful to share just because it is from, I believe, one of our other publishers. Margins, though, advance should be included in 5% of royalties because an advance needs to be earned back. So it's, you know, this person is letting everybody know that an advance would be something that should be factored into the percentage. Absolutely. Which is not a bad way of thinking about it. Yeah. And then Ksenia, hi Brent, the margins example doesn't include marketing expenses and publishing advanced reading copies. Is that something not expected of the small presses? Which we touched on some of that with copies in exchange, but does not include some of these review copies and stuff.
Yeah, that's coming right out of that 5% profit of your own. So good luck. The short answer is most presses, as we define them in the slides at the small press level, they're almost all of what they're doing is, free internet marketing. It's labor, but they're often not paying for ads. And those, we often question those at SPD. They have to be really targeted we offer a suite of them, and even when we offer them, we're like, okay, this needs to be very cheap, very well targeted, and that is the point where you maybe think about involving the author.
Awesome. So somebody here has a question, Kyle, about approximately what percentage of SPD sales go directly to the reader consumer. So that would be like what we might call direct sales, Brent.
Yeah, I think it's it's about 6%. We are the only distributor that has a website. We feel it's part of our mission. If people really want the books, they can come directly. Most distributors work behind the scenes, but really most of what we're doing is selling to big resellers, online resellers, Amazon, Ingram, bookstores, libraries. That's really 94% of what the sales are.
Awesome. Martin Willits asked if I could send the link to the emails, and yeah, I will go ahead and send a link, all the links I shared in the chat when I share the slides and the recording of this workshop, so don't worry about that. Cal asks, what does the process look like when a press turns a book over to you? How do you communicate with and sell to bookstores? So again, half of that question I would say could probably be answered at the next workshop. But certainly with like how to communicate with and sell to bookstores, a lot of that was also covered in the workshop before this, which is our marketing and publicity workshop. And I'll go ahead and also send a recording of that as well, because I think that has a lot of information that could be helpful to this as well. But if there's anything else you want to add to that, Brent.
No, there is a detail that often comes up. When we take on a press, we really take on whatever you're going to publish. So, you know, we don't take per book, and that's true of most distributors. So, you know, we're starting a relationship with you, and we don't get very involved in the editorial choices, but when you have that new book come out, the idea is we're going to carry it. And so.
And then Martin Willits also added some more helpful information about becoming a 501c3 in the chat. If people would like to check that out, you can do that there. Emily Wallace asks, could we talk a little bit about literary journals distributed by SPD? Again, some of that might get covered in our next workshop, but Brent, if you have anything you want to say about that.
Well, we try to be positive about it, and you know, we love them very much. They have not tended to do well in the trade in the last 10, 15 years for a lot of reasons. I can name some of them. I mean, libraries have had their budgets cut. They generally want academic journals still. There's a lot of sense of that a literary journal belongs online and there it's free. Bookstores have really diminished the amount of them that will carry a journal. So you're just up against a lot. When SPD tends to actually pretty much flat out will probably say no to a publisher that comes to us that is only planning to do literary journals. If you're doing print books, monographs, and then also have journals as something you occasionally bring out, we'll have that conversation, but there's structural reasons why it's just a hard slog.
And then Sonia L asks, where would you recommend we look for grants for presses that might not be located in the United States?
Oh, interesting. I don't know. I mean, I did refer to, you know, some of these other countries have art budgets for the arts that are just blow us away. Shocking. And so we have run into a lot of cases where there's a translation from, say, whatever French author, and you're going to publish it in the United States. But I don't really know the reverse. But I would guess that if the press is not located in the United States, that you're probably in better shape than most of our presses in terms of public funding.
Great. And then this is another international press question for international question. For book sales outside of the US, do distributors, including SPD, outsource printing to local partners, or do they do it themselves? How does this affect the book's price in the foreign market? Just to be clear, SPD does not do printing, and neither do most distributors, although places like Ingram and Amazon do have print on demand products that they market as well, in along with their distribution. But do you have any insight for that, Brent?
Well, very briefly, international distribution for a US-based press is a big topic. I have a really long, tedious, wonderful thing I can send around if people are interested. Just email me. I'd be happy to send it out. It's ornate, but essentially SPD is not providing international distribution. It's a whole thing. There is a kind of workaround that's fairly inexpensive that involves printing through, I don't want to necessarily advertise for them, but Ingram through Lightning Source. They have printers stationed for POD printing in all kinds of countries that can allow you some reach into those international markets. SPD will ship a book to a foreign country, and we do that, but it's expensive, and we don't have printers based in those other countries. It's just not what we do.
Wonderful. And then here's an interesting question. Brent, do you have any advice for presses looking to work with nicer end papers, etc.?
No, I want to meet you. Sounds great.
That could be a question that could be answered by like maybe asking for samples, like talking with printers and seeing what kinds of options they have. They're going to have different quality options, certainly, and different paper options, cover stock options, things like that.
There's some people on this call. Kyle Schlesinger is a couple of names down that will know this stuff way better than me.
There's some helpful info from Kyle and a couple of other people actually here about 501c3s. I encourage people who might have questions to look through. And then a good question from Patrick Davis, which is, do you distribute to bookshop.org? So bookshop.org, right now, all of their fulfillment is done through Ingram. So if you order from bookshop.org, your book is shipped from Ingram's warehouse directly to you. Ingram orders from us. And so almost all of the books that are available through SPD should be available through bookshop.org. If you are a publisher and your book is not on bookshop.org, please reach out to us and let us know for sure. And then here's an interesting question. Does SPD have a database of college libraries and bookstores?
We have a big database. It's got a lot of stuff on it. Yeah, depends what you're looking for. And we hand out a lot of that data to our publishers. A couple of quick quirks about that, first of all, we don't always have the email, which is often what people do want. They don't necessarily provide it. But secondly, I think people have grasped this. We're really selling to a lot of middle people. So your book at SPD might be selling really well to some college stores who just use Ingram. And so we have no real awareness. And following it back up that chain, figuring out from both sides, maybe your author tells you, oh, my book got taught in this class, and then you contact the professor, and SPD trying to follow it up the channel and get information back from Ingram, who won't tell us really who they sold it to, but as best we can, figuring out who the customers are it can be a lot of work, but it can be useful for figuring out, how to market your book better.
Another thing that's helpful to note is that SPD does have a list of libraries, both academic libraries and public libraries that have standing orders. And so they will order from us. And so we certainly do get SPD titles in quite a few libraries. And we also do a fair amount of marketing to academic institutions and professors and work with them for course adoptions. We do offer desk copies, things like that, that can really help with that sort of market, if that is also part of this question. And then, yeah, some other questions here. Some other info from J.K. Fowler from Nomadic Press, who was also a 501c3, so some really great experience there that I would definitely check out. And then, yeah, Haran here is asking about the link to the previous event about marketing. So in the next, in the email that I'll send all of y'all with this recording and the slides, I'll go ahead and just include that as well. Thank you for letting me know about that. And then, yeah, I think that is all of the questions, and we are sitting here right at the end, the very end of our workshop, now hitting 4 p.m. I see here, sorry, there's one more question. Does SPD cover individual writers from presses that already have books listed on SPD? No, we do not. We work specifically with the publishers. So we wouldn't necessarily cover, we wouldn't necessarily cover a title just because we cover another author's title. But we do carry all of the titles from any given publisher that are still in print. And then another question from Emily, what advice do you have for us to encourage bookstores to use SPD instead of Ingram? Well, that would be great. Yeah, if anybody wants to talk to us, we would love to have a conversation about that. We definitely rely on a lot of the goodwill from both our publishers and the small bookstores that we work with. And we do work with a lot of very small bookstores to make sure that they can kind of curate a really diverse array of small press publishing that's representative of kind of what we do. So definitely, thanks so much. We want you to replace Amazon. Well, we're working on it. We're working on it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
That's workshop number 3.
I know that there's probably so many more questions, and unfortunately this is really just an overview, but again, just want to make ourselves available. Brent is available. You can email him at brent@spdbooks.org. You can feel free to email me at e@spdbooks.org. I will be emailing you if you registered for this workshop, and so you will have my email that way. And I'll go ahead and send all of that out. It may take a few days just because the recording can sometimes take a little while to load, but as soon as that is done, I will go ahead and send that out to y'all. Thanks so much. And
thank you all.
I hope y'all have a lovely rest of your Tuesday afternoon and evening. Take good care. Please stay inside if you're in California and dealing with the smoke. Otherwise, please enjoy the sunshine and stay safe and healthy.